If you or someone you know hates neurology like me, and you're trying to study for it for the NAVLE so that you can successfully answer a question in 30 seconds or less, keep watching. Welcome to another edition of The Modern Vet. Of course, I'm going to be going through another NAVLE question. This time is going to be all about neurology. Believe it or not, the NAVLE loves to throw in questions that have to do with finding the lesion or localizing the lesion. For today's question is going to be all about the segment C1, C5, C6, C2, T3, L3, and L4, S3. This question is provided by VetPrep. I got it in my question of the day when I was studying. So here we go. Okay, so we have a 2-year-old male castrated mixed breed dog who presented to you for an altered gait after being hit by a car. On physical exam, the thoracic limbs were showing decreased biceps and triceps reflexes along with decreased muscle tone. The pelvic limbs had hyperreflexive patellar and gastrocnemius reflexes and increased muscle tone. Where is a spinal cord lesion? First of all, remember what you're being asked. We just need to localize the lesion. However, remember in my last video, I talked about distractors or fluff that will be thrown into questions to try to trip you up a little bit. I mean, they're not trying to be mean, but you know, we already know this is strictly a neuro question. So details regarding the altered gait, regarding the types of muscles that are affected as far as the reflexes are concerned, that's not really important. What's important is knowing the limbs that are affected. Is it the thoracic? Is it the pelvic? Is it both? Is the neck affected? Is the tail affected? As far as the muscle tone is concerned, is it increased? Is it decreased or normal? As far as reflexes are concerned, are they hyperreflexive or hyporeflexive or normal? Those are the biggest things that we need to think about when we have 30 seconds to answer a question that we already know is loaded in and of itself. Everything about neurology is just mind blowing. So whenever I see a question like this, the first thing that I like to do is to draw my stick figure dog. So I have my head, and then I have a makeshift neck, and then I have my thoracic limbs, then the long stick back, then my pelvic limbs, and then the tail. Then I go back and I label the neck area, upper neck area, as C1 to C5. Then right over the thoracic limbs in that area, I label that as C6 to T2. And then along the dorsum, the trunk, I have T3, L3, and then over by the pelvic limbs down there, I have L4, S3. That is the first thing that I do before I answer this question. The second thing that I do, I label upper motor neuron up by C1, C5, lower motor neuron by C6, T2, upper motor neuron by T3, L3, and then lower motor neuron by L4, S3. There are different ways to do this, and you'll probably learn a different way on clinics by a faculty member or resident or intern, but for the sake of this test and from me to you, this is what has helped me tremendously. Now, the third thing I'm going to do is remember what I would typically see if I had a lesion by, in an upper motor neuron area versus a lower motor neuron area. So for upper motor neuron lesions, typically you are going to see hyperreflexia and increased muscle tone. Then for the lower motor neuron, typically you will see hyporeflexia and decreased muscle tone. Next, I go back to the question and I try to figure out what parts of the body are affected. Is the neck affected? Are the thoracic limbs affected? Are the pelvic limbs affected? Is the tail affected? So this question, they do not mention that the neck is affected. They mention that the thoracic limbs are affected, so you can put a check mark there. And they make note that the pelvic limbs are affected, so you can make a check mark there. Then I say to myself, well, how are the pelvic limbs affected? How are the thoracic limbs affected? Well, the thoracic limbs are showing hyporeflexia and decreased muscle tone. So in my head, I'm thinking, lower motor neuron signs. Then I think about the pelvic side. The pelvic limbs are showing signs of hyperreflexia and increased muscle tone, which are suggestive of upper motor neuron signs. So I'm now going to look at my answer choices, which really are, is it L4S3, is it C6C2, etc. They're basically asking which one of the segments is affected. Side note, in clinical settings, you'll sometimes find one lesion, you'll sometimes see that there are multifocal lesions showing you so many different clinical signs. But thankfully, the NAVLE question writers are gracious, and I have not heard of a single time where they have included multifocal lesions of the spinal cord. So thankfully, we can just focus on one. All right, so we can either start from the tail and work our way up, or we can start from the neck and work our way down. But I'm going to give you a little trick. The trick is knowing which limbs are affected, and that will dictate, at least for me, where I should start, whether I should start at the neck or start by the tail. Guys, both the pelvic limbs and the thoracic limbs are affected. It doesn't matter how, meaning if it's hyper, hypo, hypo, hyper, right now it doesn't matter. I just know that the thoracic limbs and the pelvic limbs are affected, which means that my lesion is not at the tail end of the dog, but at the neck end of the dog, so more the cervical region, which also means that I can immediately push away T3L3 and push away L4S4 because the thoracic limbs and pelvic limbs are affected. So I'm going to focus on my cervical segments, which are C1, C5, and C6T2. Now, you're like, okay, I got 20 seconds left. Which one is it? All right, guys. Remembering, and I'm going to repeat myself here because sometimes repetition helps, at least for me. Remembering that C1, C5, any lesion there will give me upper motor neuron signs. In that case, I would expect my thoracic limbs to have upper motor neuron signs and my pelvic limbs to have upper motor neuron signs. The dog is showing lower motor neuron signs at the thoracic limbs and upper motor neuron signs at the pelvic limbs. So again, that is not C1, C5 because any lesion there would give me upper motor neuron signs in both sets of limbs. So of course I'm going to move down to C6T2, which is where my lower motor neuron bundle or intumescence is. And any lesion there is going to give me lower motor neuron signs in the thoracic limbs and upper motor neuron signs by the pelvic limbs. So once again, any lesion by C6T2 is going to give me lower motor neuron signs of hyporeflexes and decreased muscle tone in the thoracic limbs, and I will see upper motor neuron signs in the pelvic limbs of hyperreflexes and increased muscle tone, which is what the dog is showing in this question stem. So the lesion is at C6T2. I hope that made sense. This question is kind of stripping away all the extra things such as conscious proprioceptive deficits, loss of sensory output. It's simply focusing on the upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron segments, C1, C5, C62, blah, blah, blah. And they just want you to know, can you quickly localize this lesion? Let's just say we're not giving you any other information as far as our CP deficits and things of that nature. Can you use what's given and figure out this answer? All right, that was pretty loaded. And for me, neurology can be a little bit tricky, and sometimes I have to go it over again and again and again. But I really hope that how I went through this question will give you some extra tools in your pocket to use whenever it shows up on your VetPrep or when it shows up on the NAVLE in November. If you have any questions at all, feel free to post them below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Also, in the description box below, I've posted a link to an article in VIN that does an incredible job at going over neurolocalization from top to bottom, and it's really digestible information, and I have used it in the past to help me figure out the whys, the hows, all that stuff when it comes to neurolocalization. All right, guys, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out when you do so. And thank you so much to all the new subscribers. Thank you so much to all the viewers. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to making the next video. And I'm not sure what my topic should be. If you have any suggestions, drop it down below. Until next time, bye.